good morning to you all. This session is, when we were planning this, the programme for this festival, and it's been many months in the planning, and it's wonderful that it's come to life now, we wanted to make sure that there was the opportunity for hearing a range of voices and to enable people to think about some of the sort of bigger topics and not just simply down at the sort of detail. So today's session, and we're very grateful to the Dean of York to coming to chair it, enables a representative range of voices, and the Dean will enable the panellists to introduce themselves to be able to share in this concept of what makes for good worship. I will come back at the end to announce some sort of just slight practicalities for how the day unfolds, about where the afternoon is and about the session that immediately follows this. But in the meantime, I will simply get out of the way. And of course, the other thing I was just going to say is that it's wonderful that I know that online there's an audience from across the world. There are actually people from across the world in the room as well. We know they've come from as far afield as Canada and New Zealand. So there's a wide context that we're speaking to here today, and I hope everyone enjoys it. So, Dean Dominic, we're very grateful for you being able to lead this session with these four excellent panellists here. Perhaps you join me in giving them all a welcome.
A very good morning to you. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, allow me to say welcome to York. At the Minster, we are delighted that this inaugural festival has ended up in York, and I hope you are having an absolutely wonderful weekend of it. We have indeed got a range of expertise sitting up here on my left and my right. Just so that everyone in the room and online knows where people are coming from, I wonder, panellists, if you could briefly introduce yourselves and briefly cover, in a sense, who you are and what you've done, so people know the experiences on which we draw in the ensuing discussion. Vicky?
Hello, everyone. I'm Vicky Johnson. Until about 3 weeks ago, I was presenter at the mighty York Minster. Tomorrow, I become Dean of St John's College, Cambridge. Prior to that, I was a canon at Ely Cathedral. Prior to that, a parish priest, with quite a few years' experience teaching ordinands and lay readers in the area of worship and homiletics. I'm a singer myself and have conducted choirs, including church choirs, over a number of years.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Carl Jackson. I've had a dual career as a secondary school music teacher and also as a church musician. I taught in schools in Huntingdon, Croydon, and various schools in London. As a church musician, my first post was assistant organist at Croydon Parish Church. I went back to the church as director of music, and then went to St. Peter's, Eaton Square as assistant organist for a few years, and then returned to the Chapel Royal, where I've been organ scholar. And I've been at the Chapel Royal, Hampton Court, since 1996, 20-something years.
Good morning, I'm Pete Gunstone. I'm the minor canon for worship and nurture at Bradford Cathedral, which means that I do the job of the precentor and of the cathedral safeguarding officer. Prior to ordination, I was a musician. I trained in the University of Leeds and the Royal Northern College of Music and worked freelance as a conductor and organist and harpsichordist, but also a lot in churches and in Christian communities. I was director of music at Lee Abbey, which is an international Christian community, for 3 years in the noughties. And I grew up with a father who literally had very big feet, but he was also, and he was described as a very broad churchman. And so that has been also my tradition, that I grew up comfortable in both Catholic and charismatic contexts. So I went straight from a year out with Soul Survivor in Watford to being organ scholar at Leeds Parish Church. And that sort of describes what my ministry has been a bit like since then. I was director of music for the Lambeth Conference 2 years ago, which was the absolute highlight of my life and career. And it's a joy to be serving in Bradford alongside some fantastic musicians and with some great clergy colleagues.
Good morning, my name's Tansy. I'm Director of Music at the Cathedral in Peterborough. My musical career, if you like, began at the age of about 13 and a half as an involuntary organist, an accidental organist, if you like, and then I realised I might be able to make a little bit of money, I say a little bit of money out of it, and I trained as an organ scholar in churches as a youngster, as a teenager, before moving off to study music formally as an organist and then as a conductor. I've enjoyed a career in teaching alongside my church music, and I've worked in parish churches in my sort of lead up to being Cathedral Director of Music. And in terms of education, I've worked in all through schools from 3 to 18, both as Director of Music and as Deputy Head. So I have a sort of slightly different spin, perhaps, to some of my colleagues on Cathedral musical leadership, in as much as coming from that trained musical leader and a trained musician as well. So thank you for the warm welcome.
And very briefly, I've been Dean of the Minster for 18 months now. Prior to that, for 7 years, I worked in the Episcopal Church across the pond. I was Dean of the Anglican Cathedral in Chicago. Prior to that, I was a parish priest for 12 years in the Diocese of Peterborough. And I'm only a Christian and a priest because I changed schools at the age of 12. I went to a secondary school in South London where a very, very inspiring director of music at the school was director of music at the nearby parish church, which considered itself a rival to Croydon Minster. This was in Kingston in Surrey. I found myself dragooned into a church choir, and in a sense, the rest is history. We haven't conferred together much in advance of this session. That's the gentle art of understatement I'm using there. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to ask the panellists to get the ball rolling. If time permits, and I've no idea how this will go, but if time permits, we'll also take some questions from the floor. But I want perversely to start from the opposite end of the topic. The topic being, so what makes for good worship? I wonder if perhaps, to help us focus on that, we could look at what makes, and I say this nervously, what makes for bad worship. When people get together with the intention of worshipping Almighty God, I don't want to malign the motives of anyone, past, present, or future, as they seek to praise Almighty God. But I suspect that if I asked for a completely honest show of hands, I imagine that there isn't anybody in this room who wouldn't say, on at least one occasion in their lives, they've been to something that they have felt wasn't a very good act of worship, to put it mildly. What is it, if I can put it like this, that makes for bad worship? Why don't we start at this end? Tansy, let me throw you into the hot seat first. Somebody has to go first.
I knew I should have sat at the end. I wonder whether we characterise good and bad worship, just to backtrack slightly, to get myself out of it ever so slightly, by things that we either enjoy because they are comfortable and they're in a zone which we understand and we can connect with, versus something that might challenge us, and challenge us either in terms of, from my perspective as a musician, so something that could challenge me might be, actually was a piece articulated with integrity, reliability, and those sorts of things, versus actually how is an act of worship put together? Does it have a sense of flow? Did it challenge me? Did it bring me out of my comfort zone? And so I feel like I didn't enjoy it, therefore it might not be good. I wonder if that's a starting place for me.
I think there's a preliminary question, which is what or who are we worshipping? I think there are lots of excellent examples of worship that happen up and down our country. The question is, are they worshipping Almighty God as God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ? I also think that communities of people involved in the church often exhibit fairly bad worship. I'm still a member of various social media groups of church musicians and also of clerical dress. And I have to say that some of the comments on there, I'll just say I find them very difficult. And especially those that came up in Holy Week. So I think there's something about the quality of our lives and what we are worshipping that can make for bad worship.
Yes, it's something to do with the quality of our lives. I also think that worship, it's us being able to connect with God for that hour or so. Are we in the frame of mind of connecting with God through our worship? Are we in the right frame of mind? Are those people who are helping with worship, the minister and the choir, are they doing their bit, as it were, to help those in front of them connect with God? So with the minister, it's the use of the voice, the atmosphere that has been set in the church. So often I've been to a church where there's a lot of talking, and I just find that when you enter a building, the carrier wave, as it were, should be one of silence and being able to connect with God. I remember going on a retreat to Alton Abbey and also on a holiday to Plusgarden Abbey. And what struck me was that as you entered the building, there was a sense of the numinous, a sense of silence, of being able to connect. If you've got that ability to try to connect with God in what you do, that will aid worship. But I think we are too often connected with just ourselves and social media and our phones.
I'm so pleased at the direction of this conversation. As someone who's had to orchestrate worship in various places, I wholeheartedly agree that really the most important thing for me in preparing for worship is prayer. And holding silence before worship amongst a worship team or a choir or a group of clergy, actually being very intentional about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and the direction that our worship should be going in, are all things which, for me, add to the then quality of that worship. So I think intention is critical, and prayer is critical, and I agree about the silence, holding silence. That's one of the difficult things about being a presenter, is keeping clergy quiet before a service. But I think it's vitally important that we keep that quietness so we're all really serious about what we're doing.
I wonder, I was going to ask you to just hold on to the microphone for a second to pick up on one element of that. We all up here work in moderate to very large institutions that all get quite a number of visitors and tourists. Can you just add something to that, drawing on the experience of two cathedrals and about to be a third quite imposing building that gets a lot of tourists? The challenges about how we, even if the musicians and the clergy are focused, how in the name of good worship do we convey, transmit, or sell that focus when we may well have a congregation of 200 or 300 people who are there with their phones on social media saying, I'm at York Minster, and talking to each other? How does one actually get that message across alongside the actual component bits of the liturgy?
That's a good question, and one I think I can reflect on from York particularly. I think everything I said previously would still hold true, that people are drawn to places like York and indeed the parish church, where someone might just walk in on a Sunday evening. And I think people sense the seriousness and prayerfulness of those leading worship. And I think that does then reflect and enable them to worship in whatever way they can. In York, as you know, Dominic, we spent quite some time in effect preparing people for worship by doing a welcome beforehand, almost settling people down into focusing on what they're going to do. And I think that can work in any context, whether it's a big church or a little church, whether there's 2 people worshipping with you or 2,000. That sense of intentional preparation for worship, coming primarily from those leading worship as exemplars, hopefully, can then permeate those who come in. And my experience in York, to be fair, has been largely hundreds of people taking such a lot from what we offer day by day and being really respectful from wherever they've come from in the world and whatever faith experience they bring to that offering. I suspect if we hadn't been so careful, it may not have been that way.
Tansy.
May I just pick up on something there? I think York is one of the big tourist destinations, and it's interesting to think, isn't it, about how, as a tourist destination or a venue, a church or a cathedral responds to those who come to us just once, that little drop in. And I've been at Peterborough in a really interesting time. When I first arrived, worship was a very closed experience, to the point where the building, if you like, was rather uninviting, in as much as if you're not coming to worship, you're not necessarily welcome in the same way to the building. And after some discussions as to how we can, make change, because it's the Church of England and that takes hundreds of years, it's like a sort of feather in an oil tanker, isn't it? But how can we make that change, and how can we have an act of worship, let's say a Sunday Eucharist, where we actually have tourists who are wandering around us, and actually sometimes that can feel a little bit like being in a goldfish bowl, I do have to be honest. However, I guess some of it's about meeting people where they are with what their worship needs are, and if that's their only small experience, then they might not meet you at that opportunity where you're having prayer at the start, but they might meet you at that moment of a sentence in a sermon that catches them, or the glint in a child's eye as they smile because their solo's gone really well, whatever that moment that might be that we meet them at. That's the message they could take away for the whole of the rest of their lives, you know. And I always go into Evensong thinking, actually, in a way, it doesn't matter what anyone's version of good is. If this makes a difference to somebody in some way and transcends some message back to somewhere else, I kind of think that's job done, certainly in the context of a fairly relentless schedule of services, 300 a year. They won't all necessarily meet that same standard. You won't necessarily have quiet prayer at the start of everything. So I just wanted to sort of reflect a little bit on the extremes of a building that stays open and closed and how that makes a difference as well.
Do you want to... Pete, Carl, would you like to add anything to that?
At Hampton Court, that's also a tourist trap, and you've got the chapel in the centre of it. It's a very small chapel, but people have got their headphones on, and it's got the sort of talking guide, and then they wander into the chapel, and they look in amazement at the building. We've got a small building, York, I know, and Peterborough are vast buildings, but people are drawn by what's in the building, the stones, in our case, the grandeur, the Gilton, and so on and so forth. So that, in a way, is one avenue in to that special place.
Just a brief comment to say, I think what we're talking about here is we're talking about culture. And I would take as a definition for culture the way we do things around here. And that within the Christian community, there are many different forms of culture. And we've been talking about one specific culture here. And I completely agree with everything that has been said about these large and noble buildings that do inspire us to encounter God in particular ways. But I think we perhaps also need to note that there are other cultures that encounter God in other ways. And I sometimes wonder if an outsider, I mean, it's probably an advantage in places like York, Peterborough, and the Chapel Royal, is that you get lots of outsiders. In Bradford, because the Congregationalists built a massive post office in front of us to obscure the view of the then parish church from the city, we don't get so many visitors. We're a bit more hidden. But I do wonder what the outsiders to our culture might observe. If an alien rocked up, what would they think was important to us? What would they see in what we do? What would they see of our values and what's important to us? So that's just a sort of side note to say that there are other cultures, and it'd be good to take a fresh look at ourselves now and then.
Kind of jumping off from that. One of the issues that I think comes the way of cathedral and collegiate churches quite often, sometimes from a cathedral point of view, especially in terms of the conversation that can arise when a cathedral is hosting a diocesan service aimed at people from across the breadth of the Church of England. And sometimes, particularly if people are in bad moods, the word elitism gets pulled out of its holster and pointed at us. Would any of you like to offer some thoughts about the tension of a product which, in terms of the daily round of choral evensong, is coming from a place of high education and musical sophistication? Is elitism a barrier always to being able to offer good worship? Is it a vital part of good worship? How do we say to those who come along and scratch their heads, or maybe do something that's a little more dismissive about the kind of worship that we experience in our places? How do we square the circle and answer the charge that what we're doing culturally is exclusive?
I think this is a really, really good and important question. It's one that we need to discuss more widely. I think, first of all, I'd want to say that what we do in our great cathedrals is not necessarily elitist and not necessarily a barrier. Think about Elijah. He listens for the voice of God. Does it come in the storm? Does it come in the expected cultural norms that he thought he would find the voice of God in? No, it came in a surprising way. And I think we need to be open to the work of the Spirit in people who've never encountered our culture before, wandering into our buildings and, encountering God in profound ways. I'm sure there are people here who've had that experience in their lives, and you're here because of that, because you were an outsider, but somehow, through the work of the Spirit, you became an insider to it. So I think it's a conversation we need to have very carefully. I think it can become a trope for other agendas if we're not careful.
I think part of this comes from the welcome which people receive at the church door. They see this glorious place, and then if there's a sidesman who smiles at you and says, "Welcome, come in," that I think is important as well.
I think the question of musically elite, I think I can fairly honestly say that Peterborough as a cathedral might feel elite to some, but actually on the day-to-day level is actually quite often not. We have opportunities, and I know that churches, parish churches and cathedrals across the land are working hard to bring people into worship through the vehicle of music in whichever way works for them, whether that's a Teze group, whether that's a folk band, and your guitar. My guitar was the clarinet equivalent, and the difference that can make. And actually, this is a big question for the next 30 years of how we sustain our musical tradition, because we can't continue to have this narrative of elite. Actually, everyone in the world is an elite musician. What they don't necessarily have, and the irony here is a conference of faith and music, what they don't all necessarily have is musical faith in themselves. The first thing we all do when we are born is we cry, we make sound, we scream, we make those natural noises. And I think we perhaps somehow have to work together to change that narrative that actually we are all our own person, and that makes us therefore all elite, therefore that argument can't stand. Because we all have a different gift to bring, and it doesn't matter whether you're going to a children's evensong that we have where the children are 7 years old and actually they sing mostly in unison and they only sing once a half term, or whether you're listening to the full cathedral choir. There are musicians there of all different shapes, sizes, faiths, no faith, but actually the vehicle of the worship and the music that they're encountering something through makes it no more elite than the person who came through the door having just, run from the station. Running is elite. And I think we need to change that narrative together. It still exists, but it must change somehow.
Yeah, I think I just agree particularly with Peter Tansy, well, all of you actually, in what you've said. But I think there is also something about arts and culture in this wider discussion that we need to address. There's an amazing art gallery over there. Is that elite because it's showing Monet? So I think there's some questions to kind of pull out about what this word elite is being used to address in terms of particular agendas, and reclaim what it means to offer God excellence of all that we are, wherever we are, and whatever we're doing.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to open this out to questions from the floor. We're just over the halfway point. But I wonder first whether I could ask the four of you to indulge in just a little bit of crystal ball gazing, both in terms of the secular world in which we find ourselves, including what is or what is not going on in schools and universities, and also in terms of ministering and living in a church that is changing, which faces, in some ways, increasing pressures, certainly increasing financial pressures, which bring to bear in all sorts of ways, including on the budgets available for the kind of worship we're used to offering. What is the one thing in each of your minds that the church needs to hang on to, or that the church needs to drop and replace in, I don't know, perhaps the next quarter of a century? What would be top of your agenda? Vicky?
In the course of my ministry, I've been involved in theological education in various formats, including teaching, worship, preaching, and engaging with music in worship. I think I'm a bit old-fashioned. I think our primary purpose as Christians is to worship God. If that's shocking, shock. Priest says primary purpose is to worship. That should come first in our focus. And in my own experience, I think there's been probably a diminishment in the investment in teaching of worship and preaching, and how all these things tie together in the worship of God. So I think that, for me, increased teaching, opportunities, education in worship and music in worship specifically would be a great place to start. And I think it's the right first place to start in thinking about how we offer our best worship and prayer.
You said that our primary task is to worship God. I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. But in that big wide world out there, God doesn't mean so much, which is, oh gosh, it's a crying shame, but he does to me and you. And I think the church has to navigate its way through a world where God is not seen as relevant, as not being part of you, as being in you, and the fact that you, as a human being, must worship your Creator. There are a few more elements, I think, along the road.
We're approaching Ascension and Pentecost, and after the Ascension, the disciples were in a moment of crisis. So what did they do? They went and huddled together. They were in a room. They shut themselves away. What had Jesus said to them, to those who both worshipped and doubted? Go, preach, teach, baptize, plant churches. What happens at Pentecost? They're thrown out into the world. So I think the one thing that we must not do in the next 25 years, as it becomes increasingly difficult to be someone who follows Jesus Christ, is that we must not keep on talking to ourselves. We must continue to engage as disciples with the world around us, because that is the missionary direction of the Spirit, and that is where we will find God at work, and that is how the church will be renewed.
It's very difficult to add much to those three distinguished answers, but I suppose on a practical level, I'm thinking, well, what's the vehicle to enable all of that to happen? And for me, with my educational hat on, the church's links with school have to be a vehicle of great importance going forward, because school will not go away. Cultural ideas will change. Your interpretation, mine, and the next person's interpretation of how to praise God will change. But the one thing that won't change is school will not go away. The landscape of an education in any type of school has changed. And I don't know how we tackle that, because it's a massive long game. But the link with school as an educational resource is perhaps one of our only practical ways we can actually solve that.
Thank you. We've got 15 minutes or just under left, and I wonder now if there is a question that anyone is burning to ask from the floor. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. I don't know how I'm going to phrase this, but I'm in a bit of a unique position. I'm a foreigner, so when you were talking about the alien coming in and seeing all of it, that was me. And actually, it's not the music that feels elitist or inaccessible. It's the rituals. It's the things that are taken for granted in each and every service that made me go, why are we doing that? Why are we saying these words? And as an adult, it's fine. But now I'm in this really strange position where I'm having to go into schools and not only teach children the basics of music and singing, but also prepare them to take a very active part in worship. And I'm finding myself really, really struggling to make that part accessible. So I suppose the question is, how do you make sure that it's not only accessible, but that the part they play makes it good worship for them, that they understand what they're taking part in and how significant it is, if that makes sense?
Who'd like to jump in with a response to that?
I think it's a really fantastic question. So if we think about what worship is and what the Christian community is, there's lots of rich biblical imagery. And I think at the heart of it is the Shema, or the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So at the heart, our God is community, Father, Son, and Spirit, an amazing dance together. And at the heart of Christian worship is a community that reflects and is becoming like that. So I think, yes, all the things we take for granted, we cannot take it for granted when we're introducing people to worship, that they will know or understand these things. So perhaps we have to strip things back a bit. We have to think about, as you've been doing, the preparation, the catechesis, to use a kind of posh word for it, teaching people the faith. And you might pardon this expression, but I think that, it's important that when we're introducing new people into the community that we give them manageable steps they can take. So I think, yes, there are sometimes there'll be a stage when we need to sacrifice some of our sacred cows. But then there's a journey of discipleship and growth. I think then we then reintroduce some of those things again.
Anybody else want to chime in? I think in that case we'll see if there's another question coming up from the floor. Gentleman over here.
Tansy made me promise not to ask any awkward questions. It's more of a comment, really. The first two kind of topics you covered, what makes bad worship and the charges of elitism, in a way I think they're intrinsically linked. Speaking as a church musician, if somebody accuses me of elitism, I'll say, you bet. Absolutely. If we're not aiming to be as good as we possibly can, why are we bothering? Is God not worth this? That we should be aiming for that. And the bad worship is where we're not engaged and we're not trying. And that's where it doesn't work. And I'm sure other musicians would agree that we're always aiming for that perfect performance. We never attain it, but it doesn't stop us trying. And absolutely, yes, we are elitist because worshipping God is worth it.
Does anyone? I don't think I'm not seeing a response up here. So please, let's Ben do carry on.
Hello, it says in the Bible that we should preach fresh to each generation. So shouldn't worship be fresh to each generation? So shouldn't we modify, as the lady said, to the generation that's coming up, using some more of their words and their vocabulary? What we've been using is ancient and wonderful and dear to our hearts, but unfortunately it's not dear to the hearts of the young people. Maybe we can develop worship for young people that would be more dear to their hearts.
Do we need worship that is more dear to the hearts of young people? Who'd like to respond? Vicky?
I think I completely understand that question, how we connect to young people, to different cultures, to the time that we live in. From my own limited experience, young people engage with tradition very well. And some of the most popular services that I've hosted for young people in lots of different places, one of the most popular was Compline, which is an ancient monastic service of night prayer. So I think I'd want to be careful about sort of a binary here, placing one thing against another and assuming that might be the way forward. I think there's a way of looking at culture and worship and connecting to God, which is broad and expansive and generous. So I'd always want to be aware of context, where you are and what works there. And that's part of our skill as Christians and worship leaders and musicians to look at our context. But I just offer the example of Choral Compline as being an amazing missionary initiative with young people that I've known.
I take that a step further, and just to draw back to Tim's point and connect that. Out of the mouths of babes, children are very, very discerning. And in my limited experience, actually, yes, you have to meet them where they are, but they do understand what good text is. They do understand what polyphony is. They do understand it, and actually, we can just occasionally, if we don't get it right, that can feel quite patronising and put them off. So to try to draw some of those things together, yes, we do have these weird rituals that we suddenly expect them to know about. But if we teach them through the vehicle of something like Choral Compline, actually how you can feel in worship and the ways that the different parts of the service can make us feel, and then you can overlay the aspiration to perhaps not necessarily be elite, but be the best version of whatever it is your offering can be, then actually you should, I would hope, be able to connect with children, because we must be careful that we don't just do everything differently for them because they are children. My limited experience quite often suggests, but actually, miss, why would we not want to do that? We want to give it a go, because only when we've given it a go, this otherworldly thing, only when we've given it a go can we genuinely say it either suits me or it doesn't. It is just my little offering there.
Just to extend on this idea of Compline, Tansy, Hugh and I have worked on a course, one of the RSCM courses in Bath, and on one night a week, the juniors go down to the church in Bath to hear Compline being sung by the seniors, and when they walk back up the hill, there's silence, because they've just been drawn to the beauty and the power of that service.
Thank you. There was John Paul, and I think there was also somebody right at the back. So we'll take those two, and that's probably going to be, I think, all we'll have time for.
Thank you. There are so many threads which are coming together in my mind, but one of the phrases which is coming to me, arising out of some of the conversation here, is we go around about being authentic, but there's a kind of authenticity almost to our improvisation, picking up a little bit on what the Archbishop was saying earlier. Something about being true to who we are, playing within that tradition, and we're sort of throwing the doors open to enable many people as possible to experience and play with and draw on that. What you were saying, Tansy, a few minutes ago about celebrating the Eucharist, but with people wandering around on the edges, I just kind of want to say yes to all of that. As a priest, as a musician, actually as a cathedral precentor, what hovers for me over all of this is that we can be as practiced and as trying as hard as we want to get everything right, and yet I think we've all had the experience of putting together something which is perfect, and yet somehow it goes clunk. And then on another occasion, something being shambolic and things not going right, and yet the Holy Spirit turns up. And how we kind of remain open to that experience, I think, is something I think we all wrestle with. That actually letting the Holy Spirit come in and be Pentecostal and blow the doors off occasionally. Trying to do that as well.
Thank you. At the back.
Hello. This was just a question going back to what you were saying about the preparedness for worship and holding that silence at the beginning before you start and a sort of inclining of the heart towards worship. Our church is one with a very conscious charism of hospitality and as a real expression of their faith, that can make for quite a sort of chatty, welcome kind of buzz environment. And so I just wondered if you had any more thoughts about that, how you sort of hold that transition without feeling like you're sort of squashing that.
I'll go first. Thank you, Becky. I think when I was talking about silence, but there's both a pragmatic silence, keeping silence actually before a service. I think there's also an inner silence that worship leaders might hold within themselves. And I think those are slightly different things. They're related to each other, of course, that if we're keeping actual silence before a service, it's a more kind of obvious way of preparing. But I think for those of us in these situations where hospitality is vital and welcome is vital in all of our contexts, I guess there's an inner preparedness that allows us to do the welcome and be chatty and friendly at the front. And then in that kind of 10 seconds, we kind of turn our mind to focus on worship. So I think every context is different, but I'd want to hold on to the concept of preparedness for worship, and that will look very different wherever it is, I think.
I think it'd be possible to sort of discuss what we've been talking, or describe what we've been talking about in terms of two opposites of transcendence and immanence, if you like. There's the silence that encourages towards transcendence and openness to that, and then there's the chattiness, which is real immanence, and both are ways of loving God and loving neighbour. Both have love at the heart of them. But then there's also the little phrase, the beyond in the midst, that in the middle of the immanence there can be incredibly transcendent moments and vice versa. But I think the key thing to all of this, to managing that cultural transition, if you like, from the chatty to the silence, is love. What is the relationship between the person curating that space and those people? Are they coming in as a sort of tut-tut, or are they coming in with an invitation into another space? And this gives me an opportunity to use a quote from David Watson, who refounded the Belfry Church, who are now going through a massive renovation project and are worshipping here at the moment. And he said the essential quality in our worship, the thing that makes a difference, the thing that you were saying, John Paul, between something that's perfect but clunky and messy but amazing, is love. If there is not love for God and of neighbour in the midst of that, it is a clanging cymbal, to quote the Apostle Paul.
I think we have stunned the panel into loving silence. And as it's 11:58, that's probably the work of the Spirit. If I could ask you to join with me in thanking the four distinguished people on my left and my right. Thank you all for your contributions.